The first time Leland Voss handed me a confidential file, he smiled while doing it. That's the part people never understand when I tell this story. They imagine some dramatic whistleblower moment. A trembling hand. A dark parking garage. Maybe rain, because apparently corporate corruption only happens during thunderstorms. Nope. It happened on a Tuesday at 2:17 p.m. while somebody microwaved burnt popcorn in the break room. Leland walked into my office holding a slim gray folder against his chest like it was completely normal and said, "Need your eyes on this before legal sees it." Then he shut the door behind him. That tiny detail mattered. Because Leland never shut doors unless he was about to manipulate somebody. I remember looking past him through the glass wall of my office. People typing. Phones ringing. Somebody laughing too hard at a joke near reception. Normal office noise. Meanwhile, my manager was about to place a lit match into my lap and pretend it wasn't gasoline-soaked. "This stays internal," he added. And right then? Yeah. That didn't sit right. But I nodded anyway. Because after 7 years at Bellcrest Financial, I'd gotten very good at nodding through disrespect. That place trained you to smile while being quietly stepped on. Especially if you weren't one of the polished golden children orbiting upper management like obedient little moons. I wasn't. Never had been. I was the guy people relied on without ever fully seeing. The clean-up guy. The fix-it guy. The one managers dumped impossible projects onto because they knew I'd stay late and solve them without making noise. You know the type. Every office has one. Mine just happened to be me. And Leland Voss had spent 3 straight years exploiting that fact with the kind of calm professionalism that made it hard to prove he was doing anything wrong. He never yelled. Never insulted anybody directly. That would have required courage. No, Leland specialized in polished humiliation. Just tightening things up, he'd say while tearing apart your presentation in front of executives. "You're reliable, Owen," he'd tell me whenever he needed another weekend sacrificed. Reliable. Man, I grew to hate that word. Reliable meant invisible. Reliable meant everybody else got recognition while you got more work. I remember one quarterly meeting where my coworker Bryce accidentally presented 3 slides from the wrong client deck. Total mess. Numbers didn't match. Forecasts were off by millions. Leland laughed it off. These things happen. Then 2 weeks later I mislabeled a spreadsheet tab during an internal review. Not the data. The tab. Leland printed the sheet and carried it into the meeting like evidence from a crime scene. "Attention to detail matters," he said calmly while everyone stared at me. Tiny stuff like that stacks over time. People think resentment arrives loud. It doesn't. It arrives quietly. One fake smile at a time. One swallowed response at a time. One elevator ride where somebody else gets credit for your work. Eventually it settles into your bones. My only real friend there was Naomi Mercer from compliance. Sharpest person in the building by a mile, which was probably why they kept sidelining her too. Naomi had this habit of leaning back in her chair during meetings like she was physically distancing herself from stupidity. One night we were both still at the office around 9, staring at opposite computer screens while cleaning up another last-minute disaster Leland dumped on us. Naomi rolled her chair toward my desk and said, "You ever notice how incompetent men always stand like they own yachts?" I laughed harder than I should have. She pointed toward Leland's office through the glass. There he is. Human cufflink. And honestly, accurate. Leland carried himself like the world owed him favorable lighting. Perfect suits. Expensive watches. Slow nods during conversations like he was evaluating whether you deserved oxygen. Guy weaponized posture. Anyway. Back to the file. The moment he left my office, I opened it. At first glance it looked routine. Vendor agreements. Internal approval sheets. Expense authorizations. Then I noticed the signatures. Or more specifically, the dates. A few pages in, there were approval timestamps that didn't line up with execution records. Expenses routed before authorization. Retroactive compliance confirmations. Nothing cartoonishly illegal. That's not how sophisticated people operate. It was cleaner than that. Subtle enough to survive surface review. But the deeper I looked, the worse it got. Vendor payments were being redirected through shell consulting groups connected to a third-party contractor named Veridian Strategic Solutions. Only Veridian barely existed. Tiny office footprint. No real staff. Inflated consulting invoices. And the approval chain? All routed through Leland. I sat there staring at the pages while the air conditioning hummed above me. That strange pressure started building behind my ribs. Not panic. Recognition. Because suddenly a bunch of things clicked into place. The rushed approvals. The weird accounting overrides. The reason Leland kept bypassing Naomi's compliance team on certain vendor reviews. And then came the line that changed everything. Naomi appeared at my doorway around 20 minutes later holding 2 coffees. Took one look at my face and said, "Well, that's either fraud or you finally opened your student loans again." I slid the file toward her. She read maybe 6 pages before whispering, "Oh, this is grounds for a lawsuit." I still remember how quiet the office suddenly felt. Naomi looked at me carefully. "You reporting this?" That was the expected answer. The moral answer. Probably the smarter answer too. But something inside me had shifted already. Because for the first time in years, Leland had made a mistake big enough to crack his own image. And he'd handed it directly to me. See, people think power comes from aggression. Most of the time it comes from information. And patience. I didn't report the file. I copied everything. Quietly. Carefully. Over the next 3 weeks, I became the calmest employee in that building. Which honestly should have terrified them more. I kept smiling through meetings. Kept fixing reports. Kept nodding when Leland dumped extra work onto me Friday afternoons. But meanwhile, I started paying attention differently. Patterns. Conversations. Timelines. Turns out once people assume you're harmless, they stop hiding things around you. Leland especially. He started using me more directly after that. Need these numbers cleaned before audit review. Can you adjust formatting on these expense allocations? Legal doesn't need full drafts yet. Little comments. Tiny cracks. Meanwhile, Naomi quietly helped me map the structure behind the payments without officially touching the files herself. Smart move. Plausible distance. We started meeting after work at a tiny bar 3 blocks from the office where the bartender called everybody "Chief," regardless of age or gender. Naomi spread printed records across the table one night and said, "You realize he thinks you're covering for him now." I know. You okay with that? I took a sip of whiskey. "No," I said. "But I'm patient." She watched me carefully after that. Like she was trying to figure out whether patience and resentment had started blending into something dangerous. Maybe they had. But I wasn't planning to destroy anybody. I just wasn't planning to protect them anymore either. The real turning point came during the Hawthorne acquisition review. Huge deal for Bellcrest. Multi-state expansion. Executive-level visibility everywhere. Everybody was tense for weeks. Which made Leland sloppier. Pressure exposes personality. His got meaner. One morning he tore apart Bryce during a meeting so aggressively the room went silent. Funny thing? Bryce used to love being on Leland's good side. Turns out favoritism feels different once it rotates away from you. After the meeting, Bryce cornered me near the elevators and muttered, "Guy's turning into a psycho." I almost laughed. Turning into? Buddy, he'd always been this guy. You just weren't standing where I was standing before. That same week, Leland called me into his office. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Expensive bourbon sitting untouched on a side shelf because corporate men love decorative alcohol. He closed the door. Again. "I need discretion from you," he said. There it was. That word. Discretion. Corporate language for "please help me bury this." He slid another folder across the desk. Updated vendor routing sheets. Revised approval logs. Backdated edits. I looked up slowly. "You want me to process these?" "Just administrative cleanup." "Sure. And raccoons are just outdoor cats." I flipped through the pages calmly while Leland watched me. "You're one of the few people here I trust," he added. Man. That almost made me angry enough to smile. Because after years of treating me like furniture, suddenly I was trustworthy? Not valuable. Not respected. Useful. There's a difference. I set the folder down carefully. "When does legal review start?" "Monday morning." "And compliance?" "I'll handle compliance." Of course he would. Because compliance meant Naomi. And Naomi asked questions. The thing about arrogant people is they mistake control for invincibility. Leland thought he was managing risk. What he was actually doing was creating witnesses. By then I'd already organized everything. Time-stamped records. Internal emails. Approval discrepancies. Cross-referenced payment chains. Not stolen. Not manipulated. Just preserved. Truth has weight all by itself if you document it correctly. Naomi helped me connect with an external audit attorney through her cousin in Chicago. Quiet consultation. Entirely legal. Mostly hypothetical. The attorney said one sentence that stuck with me. Executives survive mistakes. They rarely survive patterns. Exactly. So I waited. Monday arrived like a storm nobody else could smell yet. The Hawthorne Review meeting filled the executive conference room by 8:30. Senior partners. Legal advisors. Audit representatives. Regional directors. Leland walked in wearing this dark navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. Confident. Relaxed. Smiling. Guy thought he owned the room. And for a while, he did. Presentation started smoothly. Forecasts. Expansion timelines. Risk analysis. Everybody nodding along while expensive coffee steamed across polished glass tables. Then one audit director asked a simple question about vendor authorization sequencing. Simple questions are dangerous. Leland answered quickly. Too quickly. I watched Naomi across the room. She didn't even look at me. Just kept typing notes calmly. The audit director frowned. "Can we see the original approval chain?" Leland's jaw tightened for maybe half a second. Tiny movement. Most people wouldn't notice. I did. Because after years under somebody, you learn their weather patterns. "Of course," he said smoothly. That's when I spoke for the first time all meeting. I have the archived versions here too. Room went quiet. Not dramatically quiet. Worse. Professional quiet. I handed printed copies across the table. Real copies. Original timestamps. Unedited routing logs. I still remember the exact moment Leland realized what was happening. His expression didn't collapse immediately. People like him are too practiced for that. But his eyes changed. Calculation replaced confidence. The audit director flipped through pages slowly. Another executive leaned forward. Then another. Nobody spoke for almost 30 seconds. Which in corporate time is basically a hostage situation. Finally, one of the legal advisors said, very carefully, "These versions don't match the submitted records." Leland turned toward me. Calm voice. Dangerous eyes. "Owen, where exactly did these come from?" And there it was. The moment. Years of fake smiles and swallowed frustration condensing into one quiet decision. I met his stare evenly. "The original internal archives," I said. "The ones you asked me to clean up." Naomi stopped typing. Not because she was surprised. Because she knew the room just shifted permanently. Leland tried recovering. Tried framing it as administrative confusion. Clerical overlap. Revision sequencing. But arrogance makes people over-explain. And every explanation created new questions. Questions led to records. Records led to patterns. Patterns led to panic. The meeting ended 40 minutes early. By lunchtime, external auditors occupied 3 conference rooms. By Wednesday, Leland was placed on administrative leave. And Bryce? Bryce wouldn't stop pacing around the office whispering, "Holy hell." Funny how fast power evaporates once people stop pretending to believe in it. The real fallout happened quietly after that. No screaming matches. No dramatic perp walks. Just absence. Leland's office emptied over 2 days. Then his name disappeared from internal directories. Then executives started speaking about him carefully, like a contaminated memory. Corporate environments do that. They erase people efficiently. But the part that mattered most to me happened a week later. I was sitting in the cafeteria early morning before most employees arrived when Bryce approached holding coffee. Awkward guy suddenly looked about 10 years older. He sat across from me and said, "I owe you an apology." I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For acting like you were just," he hesitated. "I don't know. Background noise, I guess." That one landed harder than he intended. Because he was right. That's exactly how they saw me. Reliable. Invisible. Useful. Until suddenly I wasn't. I shrugged lightly. "You weren't the only one." He nodded slowly. Then after a second he said, "Still. You handled all this different than I would've." "Yeah. I would've blown everything up immediately." I looked out the cafeteria windows at the gray morning rain sliding down the glass. "Sometimes," I said, "timing matters more than anger." Naomi quit 3 months later. Better position. Better pay. Less nonsense. Before leaving, she dropped a small box on my desk containing one item. A novelty yacht keychain. Attached was a sticky note. "For incompetent men." I laughed so hard security glanced over. As for me? Bellcrest offered me a promotion eventually. Director level. Funny timing, right? I turned it down. Not dramatically. Just calmly. Because somewhere along the way I realized I didn't actually want to win their game anymore. I wanted peace. These days I work for a smaller consulting firm outside Minneapolis. Less prestige. Better people. Nobody here performs power like theater. Last winter Naomi visited during a conference nearby, and we grabbed drinks at this rooftop place overlooking the river. Snow falling softly. City lights blurred in the cold. At one point she leaned against the railing and asked, "You ever regret not reporting him immediately?" I thought about it honestly. Then shook my head. No. Why? Because immediate reactions are emotional. What I did was structural. Leland spent years building a system where he could quietly diminish people while protecting himself behind professionalism and hierarchy. I didn't destroy him. I just stopped absorbing the impact for him. And eventually, the weight landed where it belonged. Naomi smiled into her glass. Still scary how calm you were through all that. I looked out across the frozen river below us. Yeah, I said quietly. Me too. Then we stood there in comfortable silence while snow drifted across the skyline and the city kept moving without either of us needing to prove anything anymore.